In this harsh land, a promise isn't spoken in words, it's carved into skin. A debt isn't paid in gold, but in blood. 5 years ago, Silas had learned that lesson the hard way. He was lying on the cracked, unforgiving earth, the sun a merciless hammer overhead, his canteen long empty, and his hope a fading mirage. He was ready for the end, for the vultures he could see circling high above, when a shadow fell over him. A native man, appearing like a ghost from the shimmering heat, knelt beside him. He didn't speak. He simply offered a water skin. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a trade. It was a gift of life, given freely to a stranger on the brink of death. Silas never forgot the man's weathered face, etched with the wisdom of the mountains and plains, but more than that, he never forgot the tattoo on his forearm, a hawk in mid-flight, its wings spread wide against an unseen wind. It was a symbol of life soaring above the dead earth, a brand on his memory, a debt he never knew how he could possibly repay. Now Silas, a man of few words with the memory of long, lonely trails etched into the corners of his eyes, rode into a dust-choked border town for a single, simple purpose: to buy a good horse. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, sweat and desperation. It was a place where honor went to die. He was minding his own business, his gaze fixed on the stables at the far end of the street, when the grating voice of an auctioneer cut through the afternoon haze, drawing a lazy, cruel crowd to the town's grimy center. Curiosity was a luxury Silas rarely afforded himself, but something in the man's taunting, mocking tone made him stop. The sight that met him made his stomach clench into a hard, cold knot. On a rickety wooden stage, a young woman stood bound at the wrists, her clothes torn to rags, her black hair a tangled mess that couldn't quite hide a face streaked with dirt and defiance. She was being sold like livestock, a piece of property for the highest bidder. The crowd, a miserable collection of grimy prospectors and bored cattle hands, jeered and made crude remarks. The girl's eyes were fixed on the splintered floorboards, but it wasn't submission in her posture. It was a tightly coiled fury, a silent promise of violence to anyone who dared touch her. Silas felt a familiar, bitter disgust rise in his throat. This world was full of casual cruelty, and he'd learned long ago that trying to fix it was a fool's errand. He turned to leave. This wasn't his fight. But then the auctioneer, a fat man with a sweaty brow, trying to entice a higher bid, yanked the ragged cloth from her shoulder to better display his merchandise. Silas's heart stopped. There on her skin, stark against the dust and bruises, was the tattoo. A hawk, wings spread, captured in perfect, soaring detail. It was identical. The same lines, the same defiant spirit he'd seen on the arm of the man who had saved his life. It wasn't a coincidence. In this God-forsaken land, there were no coincidences. There was only fate and the debts that came with it. He didn't know who this girl was. He didn't know her story or what horrors had brought her to this wretched stage. But he knew the mark she carried. It was the mark of his savior. In that instant, every thought of a new horse, of his own journey, of the quiet life he tried to lead, vanished like smoke. All that remained was the debt, staring him in the face, demanding to be paid. Before the next bid could be called, before another leering comment could foul the air, a voice cut through the noise. It was low, steady, and carried an authority that silenced the entire crowd. It was the voice of Silas. "Stop, I'll buy her." If this story's got its hooks in you, comment number 1 down below. Subscribe to the channel and help us build this posse to 1,000 strong. Stick around. A simple debt is about to become a blood feud. No one objected. No one dared. The jeering crowd, so bold just a moment ago, shrank back into a collective shuffling silence. The raw certainty in Silas's voice had a weight to it, a finality that brooked no argument. They shifted their uneasy gaze from the girl to the stranger, a mix of fear and fresh curiosity in their eyes. Who was this man who would pay a fortune for a half-broken native girl? Silas ignored them all. He moved with a purpose that parted the crowd like a ship's bow through water. He stepped onto the rickety stage and, without looking at the stunned auctioneer, tossed a heavy pouch of coins at the man's feet. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that echoed in the sudden quiet. More than enough. He didn't wait for change. He didn't care for the conventions of the transaction. This was not a purchase, it was a reclamation. He knelt before the girl, whose name he still didn't know. She flinched as he raised his hand, her body tensing for a blow that didn't come. Her life had taught her that a man's hand, raised in her direction, meant only pain. Instead, she heard the sharp, clean hiss of his blade being drawn from the sheath on his hip. Her eyes widened, bracing for the final cut. But the blade never touched her skin. He slid the razor-sharp edge under the coarse rope binding her wrists. With a single, fluid motion, he sliced through the fibers. They parted, and her hands were free. She stared at them, flexing her fingers slowly as if they belonged to someone else. The circulation returning sent pins and needles through her raw, chafed skin. Then she looked back at him, her expression a storm of confusion, suspicion, and a deep, defensive distrust that had been her only shield for days, or maybe weeks. She'd been pulled from one circle of hell, but she knew all too well that there were others waiting. A white man's charity was often just a different kind of cage, one with gilded bars and a longer chain. He stood, turned his back to her, and stepped off the stage. It was a test, a choice. He didn't grab her, didn't command her to follow. He simply started walking. For a long moment, she remained frozen, the whispers of the dispersing crowd like snakes in the grass around her. Then, with a hesitant step, she followed. They left the town square in silence. The only sounds were their boots in the thick dust and the whispers of the crowd fading behind them. He led her away from the noise, toward the relative quiet of the stables, where his horse, a powerful roan with intelligent eyes, was tied. The horse nickered softly as Silas approached, then fell silent, sensing the tension, its gaze shifting to the strange, silent girl trailing its master. Silas didn't speak. Words were clumsy things, easy to misunderstand, and the chasm of fear and history that separated them felt a mile wide. Actions were better. Actions were true. He untied a water skin from his saddle and held it out to her. It was the same simple gesture that had saved his life 5 years ago. Her eyes darted from the water to his face, then back again, searching for the trick, the angle, the hidden price. Seeing none, she snatched it from his hand with a sudden, bird-like quickness. She drank, long and deep, the cool water spilling down her chin and tracing clean paths through the grime on her neck. But she never took her eyes off him, watching him over the rim of the skin, ready to fight or flee at the slightest provocation. When she was finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and held the skin out, her movement still wary. Silas took it and secured it to his saddle. He knew he had to break the silence now. He had to bridge the chasm. He gestured not at her face but at her shoulder, at the symbol that had changed the course of his day, and now his life. "I've seen that mark before," he said, his voice low and rough. Unaccustomed to explanation, he kept it simple, kept it true. There was no other way. On a man's arm. He saved my life in the desert. I was dying of thirst. For the first time since he'd seen her, the hard, defensive shell around the girl cracked. Her wide eyes, which had held nothing but suspicion and caged fury, now flickered with a raw, painful light. It was hope, so fragile and so unexpected it was almost agony to look at. Her lips parted, but only dust and a broken, rasping sound came out. She swallowed hard, trying again, forcing a voice from a throat tight with grief. "Kael," she whispered, the name a sacred, shattered thing. That was my father. The name settled the final piece into place. Kael. The debt now had a name. Silas felt a great weight settle onto his shoulders, but it wasn't the crushing weight of a burden. It was the solid, grounding weight of honor, of a path finally made clear after 5 years of aimless wandering. He had found his chance to repay the man who had given him back his life. The scales could be balanced, but as she began to speak, the story tumbling out of her in ragged, desperate bursts, Silas realized the debt was far deeper, far darker, and far bloodier than he had ever imagined. Her village, a peaceful place hidden in the canyons, had been attacked. Raiders, she said, had demanded tribute, a tax for living on land that had been theirs for generations. Her people had refused. Her father, Cale, had led the fight to defend their homes. He was a leader, a man of peace, but he would not bow to tyrants. He fought with the fury of a hawk defending its nest, and he had been killed. As she spoke of it, a tremor of pure, undiluted hatred shook her small frame, a rage so profound it seemed too large for her body to contain. The raiders had burned their homes, taken their winter stores, and dragged her and her two younger sisters, Ilara and Nuri, away as spoils of war. She had managed to escape in the chaos of a drunken victory celebration, running into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. But her freedom was short-lived. She was caught days later by slavers, men who prowled the wastes looking for lost souls and brought to this hellhole of a town. Her sisters, however, had not been so lucky. They remained with the raiders, captives in a place she'd only heard whispered in fear by other prisoners. A brutal, inescapable canyon stronghold. Scorpion's Moor, she said, the name itself a venomous curse on her tongue, her eyes burning with a desperate fire. The air grew cold, despite the afternoon sun. Silas looked at the girl at Lyra and saw the fierce pride of her father, but now he also saw the terrified faces of the two girls he'd never met, trapped in a place called Scorpion's Moor. The weight on his shoulders shifted, transforming. It was no longer the simple, clean weight of a past debt owed to a dead man. It became the heavy, burning, immediate weight of the living. His compassion, the very thing that made him pay the auctioneer, now mixed with a cold, rising anger that settled deep in his gut. This wasn't about balancing a ledger anymore. This was about justice. He wasn't just repaying a dead man. He was going to war for him. If you believe some debts are worth dying for, hit that like button and comment number 2. Share this tale of frontier honor and make sure you're subscribed. The trail to Scorpion's Moor is a one-way ticket to hell. Don't get left behind. The decision was made without a single spoken word. It passed between them in a long, silent look across the dusty stable yard, the weary horse standing as their only witness. Silas looked into Lyra's eyes and saw the ghost of her father there, an unshakable resolve, a core of granite that refused to be broken. The grief in her gaze was a deep, dark well, but beneath it, a fire of pure, unyielding determination burned. He had seen that same fire in Kael's eyes years ago, a silent refusal to surrender to the wasteland. Silas gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible. It was all the confirmation she needed. "We'll get them back," he said, the words quiet, but carrying the force of an avalanche. It wasn't a promise to a frightened girl. It was a statement of fact, a vow sealed in the dust and the dying light. The journey began immediately. Time was a luxury they did not have. Silas spent the last of his money not on the new horse he'd come for, but on essentials, hardtack that would threaten to break their teeth, strips of dried meat as tough as leather, and most importantly, ammunition. Every shell for his Colt and his Winchester was a prayer for the coming fight. As they rode out of the dusty, corrupt town, leaving its misery behind them, the dynamic between them shifted with every hoofbeat. They were no longer a rescuer and a victim, a man paying a debt and a girl caught in the crossfire. They were allies, forged in a crucible of debt and grief, two lone figures moving as one against a hostile world, bound by a single desperate purpose. The wasteland stretched out before them, an endless, bleached expanse of rock and sand that baked under the relentless sun. It was a silent, impartial enemy, sucking the moisture from their bodies and the hope from their hearts with every blistering mile. To Silas, it was a familiar adversary, a landscape to be endured, to be fought and conquered, one grueling day at a time. But to Lyra, it was something more. It was home. The harshness that would kill a lesser person was, to her, a language she understood intimately, a map etched into her soul. She was the one who led the way. After the first few hours, she slid from the back of the roan, insisting she could read the signs better on foot. Silas watched, his respect for her growing with every step. She moved with a quiet, ground-eating grace, her eyes scanning not the horizon, but the earth beneath her feet, reading the subtle story that was invisible to him. He was a skilled tracker in his own right, but her knowledge was deeper, instinctive, woven into her very being. She would stop, kneeling to touch a patch of disturbed soil. "They passed here," she would murmur, her voice low. 12 horses, heavily loaded. "See how deep the prints are? They are carrying more than just men. One horse has a loose shoe on its right foreleg." Later, she'd touch a broken creosote branch, its wound still fresh. This was snapped 2 days ago. They were moving fast then, but now, she'd point to a set of tracks. Now they are slowing. They think no one is following. She was his eyes, his compass, decoding the secret narrative written in the dust. He was the silent, watchful presence behind her, his hand never far from the worn grip of the Colt peacemaker on his hip. He was the steel to her sight, a quiet, looming promise of the violence to come. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, a relentless cycle of heat and cold. They spoke little. Words were an unnecessary weight in the vast, crushing silence of the desert. Their communication became a language of its own, a shorthand of shared glances and simple gestures. He learned the rhythm of her endurance, knowing when she needed to rest before she would admit it. She learned to trust the steady, reassuring presence at her back. At night, by a small, smokeless fire built in a shallow pit to hide its light, they would share a meal of dry bread and tougher meat. The silence between them was no longer the tense, wary quiet of the stable yard. It was the shared silence of warriors before a battle, a communion of purpose that transcended language. It was in those quiet moments that Silas truly saw her. He watched her one night as she carefully sharpened a wicked-looking knife, her father's knife, she'd told him, the only thing she had left of him. Her movements were precise, economical, deadly. He realized he wasn't looking at a child playing with a tool. He was watching a survivor honing her fang. The sight of it, of this young life so warped by violence that this grim task was second nature, stoked the slow-burning anger in his chest into a hotter flame. On the third day, the landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rugged hills, then to jagged mesas that clawed at the sky. The air grew stiller, heavier. Lyra stopped. She pointed toward a distant, dark notch in the rugged line of stone that scarred the horizon. "There," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking its name too loudly would alert the evil within. "Scorpion's Maw." It looked like a wound in the earth, a dark, jagged gash carved by some ancient, angry god. As they drew closer over the next several hours, the scale of it became terrifyingly apparent. It was a natural fortress, with towering, sheer rock walls that seemed to lean inward, creating a chasm of permanent, oppressive shadow. The entrance was a narrow, twisting passage, a kill zone for any who dared approach uninvited. Getting in would be hard. Getting out alive would be a miracle. They left the horse hidden in a cluster of boulders a mile away, its survival a secondary concern. Then they began the climb, scaling the treacherous scree slope of the canyon rim with a hunter's stealth. Loose rocks tumbled into the silence below them, each one sounding as loud as a gunshot in the tense quiet. They reached the edge as the sun began its final fiery descent, painting the clouds in shades of blood and rust. Lying flat on their bellies on the cold stone, peering over the precipice, they looked down into the belly of the beast. The canyon floor was alive. A large, roaring bonfire sat in the center of a makeshift camp, casting long, dancing, demonic shadows against the rock walls. The raucous, drunken laughter of at least a dozen men, maybe 15, drifted up to them, carried on the evening breeze. They were brutal-looking men, armed with rifles and knives, their faces hardened by a life of cruelty. They were celebrating their spoils, drinking heavily, their guard completely down. And then Silas saw them. Tied to a crude wooden post near the fire, like animals waiting for slaughter, were two small figures, two young girls. Even from this distance, through the wavering heat of the fire, he could see their matted hair, their torn clothes, the way they huddled together for a comfort that didn't exist. Ilara and Nuri. A low, guttural sound escaped Lyra's throat, a noise of pure anguish and rage, like a trapped animal. Her entire body went rigid, a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Silas instinctively put a steadying hand on her shoulder, the stone beneath his fingers vibrating with her fury. His own jaw was clenched, so tight his teeth ached, his knuckles white where he gripped the rock. The sight of those two children, so small and helpless in that den of wolves, extinguished the last flicker of hesitation or doubt in his soul. The debt to Kyle felt like a distant, intellectual thing now. This was visceral. This was a primal duty. This was wrong. They lay there in the gathering darkness, watching, waiting, the firelight reflecting in their unblinking eyes. The drunken laughter from below sounded like a personal insult, a challenge. The plan began to form between them, unspoken, a grim necessity born of the darkness and the desperate ticking clock. It was a fool's plan, a suicide mission. But as they looked at each other in the fading light, they knew it was the only one they had. 2 against 15. Think they have a ghost of a chance? Comment number 3, and tell me their odds. When night falls, they're going in, and not everyone is coming out. The moon, a cold, silver sliver, rose over the canyon rim, casting the world below in a stark relief of black shadow and pale, ghostly light. As the hours crept by, the raucous laughter from the raiders' camp dwindled, replaced by the crackle of the dying fire and the sporadic, drunken snores of men lost to their cheap whiskey. Scorpion's Moor, once a cauldron of noise, now simmered in a tense, watchful silence. This was their moment. The window of opportunity was small, and it was closing with every passing minute. There was no final discussion, no whispered words of encouragement. There was only a shared look between Silas and Lyra, a look that said everything. It's time. They began their descent. It wasn't a climb down, it was a controlled slide into darkness, a journey into the lion's den. They moved like ghosts, two shadows detaching themselves from the greater shadow of the cliff face. Every handhold was tested, every footstep placed with a deliberation that bordered on reverence for the silence of the night. A dislodged pebble could be a death sentence. A snapped twig could bring the entire camp down on them. The air was thick with a tension so palpable it felt like they were moving through water, every movement requiring immense effort and concentration. The only sound was the frantic pounding of Silas's own heart in his ears and the soft whisper of leather against stone. He watched Lyra move ahead of him and was struck again by her grace. In the desert, she had been confident, but here, in the heart of enemy territory, she was something else entirely. She was an extension of the night itself, her small frame flowing over the rock with an impossible quietness. This was her world, the world of shadows and silent vengeance. He was the outsider here, the blunt instrument of force, but she was the blade, sharp and perfectly suited to this grim work. They reached the canyon floor, melting into the deep blackness at the base of the cliff. The camp was 100 yards away. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange embers, casting just enough light to make out the sprawled shapes of the sleeping raiders. They lay like discarded dolls, bottles still clutched in their hands. But one man was still on his feet. A lone sentry, leaning against a large boulder near the edge of the camp, his rifle held loosely in his arms. His head was nodding, his body swaying slightly with the effort of fighting off a drunken slumber. He was their first, and perhaps most critical, obstacle. Silas, slowly, carefully, began to raise his Winchester. He could take the man from here. A single shot. Clean. But the crack of the rifle shot, even with a suppressor, would echo through the canyon like a thunderclap. It was too much of a risk. Before he could even fully aim, he felt a light touch on his arm. It was Lyra. She shook her head, a barely perceptible motion in the dark. Her eyes were fixed on the sentry with an unnerving intensity. She pointed to the knife at her belt, then pointed at the sentry. Then she looked back at Silas and held up a hand. "Stay here." Silas hesitated. It was his instinct to protect, to take the most dangerous task for himself. But the look in her eyes wasn't a request. It was a statement of capability. He saw the memory of her murdered father in that look, the burning need to be the one to draw first blood. He gave a reluctant, almost imperceptible nod. He held his breath and watched. Lyra moved. She didn't run or crawl, she flowed. She became a patch of deeper darkness, a ripple in the fabric of the night. Silas, a man who prided himself on his senses, could barely track her movement. One moment she was beside him, the next she was a dozen yards away, then 20. She used every rock, every patch of shadow, her feet making no sound on the sandy ground. She was a predator stalking her prey. She closed the final distance in a silent rush, rising up directly behind the dozing sentry like a phantom. There was a single fluid motion, an arm snaking around the man's throat to stifle any cry, the flash of her father's knife under the pale moonlight as it drew a swift, dark line. The sentry went rigid, a choked gurgle his only sound. He slumped to the ground without a whisper, his life seeping into the thirsty dust. Lyra stood over him for a second, her chest heaving, before melting back into the shadows and motioning for Silas to advance. When he reached her, he looked from the still body to her face. There was no triumph in her eyes, no fear, only a cold, hard emptiness. The girl from the auction block was gone, burned away by the fires of her grief. In her place stood a warrior, born of tragedy. Together, they crept into the heart of the camp. The stench of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies was overwhelming. They moved between the sleeping forms, their steps as light as falling leaves. Their target was the post in the center of the camp, where the two smaller figures were tied. As they got closer, they could hear the soft, terrified whimpers. Ilara and Nuri, they were awake. They saw Lyra appear out of the darkness, and their eyes went wide with a mixture of hope and terror. A cry of recognition started to form on Ilara's lips, but Lyra pressed a finger to her own, a silent, desperate plea for quiet. The girls understood, nodding through their tears. Lyra's hands worked quickly, her father's knife now a tool of liberation, sawing through the thick ropes that bound her sisters to the post. Silas stood guard, his Colt now in his hand, the hammer cocked, his body a coiled spring, every nerve screaming. He scanned the sleeping forms, his gaze flitting from one to the next, watching for any sign of movement, any twitch that signaled a man waking from a drunken dream. The last rope fell away. The girls were free. Lyra gathered them close, her arms wrapped around their small, trembling bodies. For a fleeting second, they were just three sisters, reunited in the heart of darkness. They had done it. They had gotten in, freed the captives, and were about to slip away unnoticed. They had achieved the impossible. But fate, in the West, is a cruel and fickle thing. A raider, sleeping close to the fire, stirred. Perhaps a nightmare, perhaps a chill in the air as the embers died. He rolled over, his eyes blinking open, unfocused. His drunken gaze drifted lazily across the camp, and then it stopped. It fixed on the four figures where there should have only been two. The shapes were wrong. The shadows were out of place. His brain, sluggish with alcohol, slowly pieced it together. His eyes widened, first in confusion, then in dawning, furious comprehension. He drew a ragged breath, his voice a raw, sleep-crusted roar that shattered the night. Alarm! They're escaping! The fuse is lit. If your heart is pounding, hit that like button and comment. Number 4. Share this story with anyone who loves a real cliffhanger. Subscribe right now. You're about to witness a storm of fire and steel. The raiders' roar tore the night apart. For a heartbeat, there was a stunned silence, and then Scorpion's maw erupted into pure, violent chaos. It was as if someone had kicked a hornet's nest. Sleeping men, groggy and slow one moment, were instantly transformed into a pack of snarling wolves. Shouted curses echoed off the canyon walls as they scrambled for their weapons. Their minds clouded with sleep and whiskey, but their instincts honed for murder. The brief, fragile peace of the night was shattered, replaced by the deadly certainty of the hunt. "Go, run!" Silas yelled, his voice a gravelly command that cut through the rising din. He shoved Lyra and her two terrified sisters toward the dark mouth of the canyon, the only path out. Ilara and Nuri stumbled, their legs weak with fear and disuse, crying out for their sister. Silas didn't run with them. He turned, planting his feet in the dirt, becoming a bulwark of granite between the fleeing girls and the coming storm. The first few raiders were on their feet now, raising their rifles, their figures silhouetted against the glowing embers. Silas raised his Colt. The hammer fell with a deafening crack that was answered by a scream. A man clutching a rifle spun and fell. The night exploded in a flash of orange fire. The peacemaker in his hand roared again and again. Each shot was a deliberate, calculated act, not a panicked spray of lead. He wasn't trying to kill them all, not yet. He was buying seconds, each one paid for in blood and thunder. A bullet whizzed past his ear, close enough for him to feel its heat. Another kicked up dust at his feet. He was a lone rock against a tidal wave of violence, and he knew he couldn't hold it back for long. But he wasn't alone. Lyra, seeing her sisters falter, didn't drag them. She pushed them, her voice sharp and urgent, forcing them toward the safety of the canyon walls. Ilara, Nuri, move, behind the rocks. She shoved them into the deep shadow of a boulder outcropping, a small pocket of relative safety. Then she turned. She didn't run. She didn't cower. The transformation that had begun in the shadows was now complete, baptized in the fire of open combat. The terrified girl from the auction block, the grieving daughter in the stable, they were gone. In their place was a warrior, a protector, a vengeful spirit given form. A raider, more daring or perhaps more drunk than the others, broke from the pack, charging forward with a long knife gleaming in the firelight. He saw Lyra as an easy target, a lone girl separated from her protector. He grinned, a predator closing in. Silas saw him and started to shift his aim, but it was too late. He was too far away. The raider never saw it coming. Lyra didn't retreat. She met his charge with a low, predatory crouch. As he lunged, she moved with a blinding speed that defied her small size. She didn't meet his force with force. She flowed around it, a whirlwind of calculated motion. Her father's knife, held in a reverse grip, became a blur. It wasn't the clumsy hacking of a desperate victim. It was the precise, deadly dance of someone who knew that a knife was not just a weapon, but an extension of her will. She ducked under his wild swing, and her blade came up, finding the soft space under his ribs. The man stopped, his forward momentum carrying him onto the blade. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the knife buried in his side, then at the girl who had put it there. He opened his mouth to scream, but only a wet, choked sound came out. He crumpled to the ground. Lyra pulled her knife free with a cold, efficient twist and didn't spare him a second glance. Her eyes were already scanning for the next threat. The retreat became a fighting withdrawal, a desperate, deadly race for their lives. It was a chaotic symphony of violence. Silas provided the thunder from a distance, his shots methodical and deadly, forcing the raiders to keep their heads down. He would fire, move, fire again, making them think there was more than one rifleman holding them back. And Lyra was the lightning up close. She darted between the rocks, her sisters huddled behind her, her knife, a constant, terrifying threat to any raider who got too close. She was their guardian angel, their avenging demon, her face a mask of cold fury in the flashing light of the gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around them, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. Every shadow could hold a new enemy, every second could be their last. Through it all they moved as a single determined unit, falling back toward the narrow canyon entrance. "The horses! We have to get to the horses!" Silas yelled, his voice hoarse. They burst from the narrow mouth of Scorpion's Moor and into the open, moonlit desert, the sounds of the enraged pursuit echoing behind them. The small alcove where Silas had left his horse seemed a mile away. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs screaming in protest. Nuri stumbled and fell, and without a word, Silas swept her up, carrying her under one arm without breaking stride, while still firing back over his shoulder. They reached the horse, a dark shape of salvation in the pale night. Silas threw Nuri into the saddle, then Ilara. Lyra vaulted up behind them, her knife still clutched in her hand. Silas took one last look back at the canyon, fired 2 more shots to discourage the first of the raiders emerging from the pass, then swung himself up behind the cantle. He dug his heels into the roan's sides. The powerful horse, spooked by the gunfire but loyal to its rider, lunged forward, launching them into a full gallop. They tore into the endless darkness of the desert, a single desperate entity fleeing for their lives. Behind them, the furious shouts and stray gunshots of the raiders slowly faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the night. They were free, they were alive. But as the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by the cold, aching reality of what had just happened, they all knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. That wasn't a girl fighting. That was a warrior claiming her vengeance. Did that transformation give you chills? Comment. Number 5. Escaping was just the beginning. What she says next changes the entire game. They rode hard, pushing the valiant roan to the very edge of its endurance. The night was a blur of wind, pounding hooves, and the desperate, gasping breaths of 4 people running from death. Silas didn't look back. There was no point. Looking back was how you got killed. He focused only on the path ahead, guiding the horse through the treacherous, moon-drenched landscape, putting as much distance as possible between them and the hell they'd just escaped. Lyra held her sisters tight, her body a living shield, her eyes scanning the darkness behind them, her senses still screaming with the adrenaline of the fight. They didn't stop until the first hint of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon, painting the bruised, purple sky with pale strokes of grey and pink. Scorpion's Moor was a distant, forgotten nightmare behind them. Silas finally reined the horse to a halt beside a small, trickling stream, its gentle murmuring a stark contrast to the violence of the night. The horse, its flanks lathered in sweat and sides heaving, drank deeply from the cool, clear water. Silas dismounted, his legs stiff and aching. He carefully lifted Nuri and Ilara from the saddle. The girls were trembling, their faces pale and tear-stained, their eyes wide with the lingering shock of their ordeal. But they were alive, they were safe. He sat them down by the water's edge and gave them the last of the water skin. As he watched them drink, a sense of profound, weary finality washed over him. He had done it. He had walked into the lion's den and pulled the lambs from its jaws. He had repaid his debt to Kale. The ledger was balanced. The thought brought him no joy, only a vast, hollow emptiness. He felt the familiar pull of the horizon, the urge to mount his horse and ride on, to leave this violence and grief behind him, just as he had left so many other towns, other fights, other people. His part in this story was over. But when he looked at Lyra, he knew he was wrong. She wasn't tending to her sisters. She wasn't drinking from the stream. She stood a few feet away, her back to them, staring out at the trail they had just traveled. She held her father's knife in her hand, not as a tool, but as if it were a part of her arm. The first rays of the morning sun caught the edge of the blade, making it gleam with a cold, unforgiving light. Her shoulders were set, her posture rigid with a tension that had nothing to do with fear. When she finally turned to face him, the look in her eyes stopped him cold. The terror, the desperation, it was gone. The relief of a survivor, the joy of being reunited with her family, it wasn't there. What he saw in her eyes was a fire. But it wasn't the warm, life-giving fire of hope. It was a cold, black, all-consuming fire of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the fire of a debt that had not yet been paid. "We're not finished," she said, her voice quiet, but as hard and sharp as obsidian. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a declaration. Silas felt the weariness settle deeper into his bones. "Lyra, they're safe. That's what matters." "What matters?" She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing. "They murdered my father. They burned our homes. They dragged us away in chains to be sold like animals. Safety isn't enough. Escaping isn't enough." She held up the knife, its point aimed not at him, but at the horizon, at the memory of their enemies. "There is still a blood debt, and it must be paid." Silas understood then. He had been focused on his own debt, his own honor-bound quest to repay a kindness. He had seen this as a rescue mission. For her, it had never been a rescue. It had been the first battle in a war. He looked at her sisters, huddled by the stream, and then back at her. To leave now would be to leave them all to the wolves. The raiders wouldn't give up. They would hunt them, not just for the escaped prisoners, but for their own wounded pride. He couldn't leave them defenseless. The ledger wasn't balanced after all. His debt was not just to the man who had saved him, but to the family he had left behind. "They'll be hunting us," he said, his voice flat, accepting the grim reality. "I know," Lyra replied, her voice devoid of any fear, "and we will hunt them." She was no longer just a guide. She was a strategist, her mind as sharp and deadly as her blade. With a stick, she began to draw in the damp earth by the stream, her movements precise and certain. Her knowledge of the land, which had been their salvation, was now to become their weapon. "They will follow our tracks," she explained, her voice low and intense. "They are angry and foolish. They will not be careful. There is a place, a few hours' ride from here, a narrow canyon the old ones call Widow's Pass. It's a shortcut through the mesas." She etched two converging lines in the dirt. "The walls are steep. The path is only wide enough for two horses to ride abreast. There is no escape, no room to maneuver. It is a natural kill box." Silas looked at the crude map, then at her face. He saw the chilling brilliance of her plan. They wouldn't just run and hide. They would turn the tables. They would transform from the hunted into the hunters. It was a staggeringly bold and dangerous idea. They were just two fighters, one of them, a girl who had seen her first real combat, only hours before, against a dozen hardened killers. The odds were impossible. It was suicide. But as he looked into her unblinking eyes, he saw a certainty that defied odds. This wasn't just about tactics for her. This was about destiny. This was about finishing what was started in her burning village. This was about honoring her father, not by running, but by fighting as he would have fought. He slowly drew his Colt, checked the cylinder, then slid it back into its holster. He picked up his rifle, feeling its familiar, solid weight in his hands. He didn't need to say a word. The quiet, weary task of preparing their weapons began. They cleaned the guns, reloaded every chamber, and redistributed the ammunition. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil and a cold, shared resolve. The sun climbed higher in the sky, but for them, the night had not ended. They were willingly descending back into the darkness. They weren't escaping anymore. They were setting a trap. They were preparing an ambush in a place called Widow's Pass, waiting for their enemies to walk, single file, into the jaws of death. The hunted have become the hunters. If you're riding with them to the bloody end, hit like, share this tale of frontier justice, and subscribe. Comment number 6 to let us know you're with them. Next stop, Widow's Pass is about to earn its name. The silence of Widow's Pass was heavy and expectant. It was a place that felt ancient, carved by wind and water, a natural tomb waiting for new occupants. Silas found his perch high on the canyon wall, a narrow ledge shielded by a weathered overhang of rock. It gave him a perfect, unobstructed view of the canyon floor below. He was a hawk in his nest, his Winchester rifle resting steady on the rock before him, its cold metal a familiar comfort in his hands. Below, Lyra was a phantom, disappearing into a deep fissure in the rock near the canyon's narrowest point, her father's knife, her only companion. Ilara and Nuri were hidden much farther back, at the entrance to the pass, their grim task to create a rock slide to block any retreat once the trap was sprung. They didn't have to wait long. The first sound was a distant, angry murmur, the thud of hooves on hard-packed earth. It grew steadily louder, closer, the sound of impending doom. They were coming, just as Lyra had predicted. Not cautiously, but with the reckless, arrogant speed of men blinded by rage and humiliation. They thought they were the hunters, chasing down a lone man and 3 terrified girls. They had no idea they were the prey, riding headlong into a carefully prepared grave. Silas chambered around. The smooth, metallic click was the only sound in his world. He sighted down the long barrel of the rifle, his breathing slow and even, his focus narrowing until all that existed was the front sight and the path below. He saw the first rider emerge into the pass. A big bearded man on a powerful black horse. The leader. He rode with a careless confidence, his rifle held loosely across his saddle. Behind him, the others followed, their formation tightening as the canyon walls closed in around them. Silas let them come deeper into the trap. He waited until the leader was directly below his position, until the 4th rider had cleared the entrance. He tracked the leader's chest, exhaled slowly, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The sound of the shot was a deafening crack that shattered the canyon's silence, a clap of thunder from a clear blue sky. The lead rider was thrown from his saddle as if struck by an invisible fist. He hit the ground in a boneless heap, his black horse rearing in panic. For a half-second, the other raiders stared in stunned disbelief. Then, from the canyon entrance behind them, came a deep, rumbling roar as Ilara and Nuri, with all their strength, pushed the precariously balanced boulders Lyra had shown them. Rocks and dust cascaded down, sealing the pass. Their escape route was gone. Panic erupted. It was in that moment of chaos that the true battle began. Silas worked the lever action of his rifle with a machine-like efficiency. Crack! A rider clutching his gut slid from his horse. Crack! Another, trying to turn his panicked mount, was knocked from the saddle. The narrow canyon had become a shooting gallery. The raiders were trapped, exposed, their numbers a liability in the confined space. They fired wildly at the cliffs, their bullets whining and ricocheting harmlessly off the stone. They couldn't see their attacker. They were fighting a ghost. But Silas wasn't the only ghost they had to fear. As the raiders scrambled for cover, their discipline gone, Lyra emerged from the fissure in the rock. She moved not with the hesitation of a girl, but with the lethal grace of a striking panther. She was a whirlwind of vengeance. A raider, his back to her as he fired up at the cliffs, never heard her approach. Her knife slid between his ribs and he collapsed without a sound. She was on to the next before he hit the ground. Another man turned, his eyes wide with shock as she seemed to materialize from the rock itself. He swung his rifle at her like a club. She ducked under it, her own blade coming up in a deadly arc that opened his throat. The battle devolved into a brutal, close-quarters slaughter. It was a symphony of violence, sharp and merciless. The thunder of Silas's rifle from above, providing covering fire, and the silent, deadly whisper of Lyra's blade below. Each shot, each thrust of the knife, was fueled by the memory of a burning village, of a murdered father, of the terrified cries of her sisters. This wasn't a fight for survival anymore. This was an extermination. One by one, the raiders fell. The canyon floor became a tangled mess of dead men and panicked, riderless horses. The symphony of violence faded, replaced by the ragged, gasping breaths of the victors and the low moans of the dying. Finally, only one man was left standing. He was pressed against the canyon wall, his pistol empty, his face a mask of pure animal terror. It was him. Lyra knew him instantly. The man with the cruel laugh who had struck her father down. He was bigger than she was, and even now held a brute strength. But in his eyes, she saw no fight left, only the certainty of his own death. Silas held his fire. He knew this last kill was not his to take. Lyra walked toward the man, her steps slow and deliberate. She was no longer a whirlwind. She was the calm at the center of the storm, an executioner approaching the block. The man slid down the rock wall, babbling, pleading. "Please, no, we'll give you anything." She stopped just before him, her shadow falling over his pathetic form. Her face was impassive, carved from stone. She looked down at him, not with hatred, but with a chilling emptiness, as if he were already a corpse. "For my father," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. She raised the knife, the blade stained with the blood of his men. The man squeezed his eyes shut. She drove the blade home. A final ragged sigh escaped his lips, and then there was only silence. A profound silence, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through Widow's Pass. Lyra stood over the last of her enemies, her chest heaving, the bloody knife still clutched in her hand. She looked up at the high ledge where Silas watched. Their eyes met across the field of slaughter. She gave a single, slow nod. "Now," she said to the wind, to the ghosts of the canyon, to the memory of her father, "now it is finished. The final bullet has been fired. The debt is paid in blood. Comment number 7 and tell me, was that justice or was that revenge? The fight may be over, but the journey home is its own kind of test." The silence that fell upon Widow's Pass was a heavy, physical thing. It was deeper than the absence of sound. It was the hollow space left behind by violence, filled only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the rocks and the thick, coppery smell of cooling blood. For a long moment, no one moved. Silas remained on his ledge, the rifle still warm in his hands, his gaze fixed on the scene below. Lyra stood among the dead, her chest rising and falling in ragged, deep breaths, her father's knife hanging limply from her hand. The fire of vengeance in her eyes had been quenched, leaving behind the grey, desolate ash of victory. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Silas began his descent. He didn't hurry. There was no one left to fight. He reached the canyon floor and walked through the carnage, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He stopped before Lyra, his gaze taking in the grim tableau around them. He looked at the knife in her hand, then at her eyes. He said nothing. There were no words for this, no congratulations for a slaughter, no comfort for a grief that had demanded such a terrible price. He simply reached out and gently took the bloody knife from her grasp, wiping it clean on the shirt of a dead raider before handing it back to her. It was a gesture of quiet finality, of closing a chapter. He went about the grim task of collecting weapons and ammunition from the fallen, his movements practical and efficient. It was a habit born of a hard life. Waste nothing, especially not the tools of survival. Lyra, her composure slowly returning, went to the canyon entrance to retrieve her sisters. When she brought them back, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe at what their sister had become, Silas had already gathered what they needed. He loaded the supplies onto the least spooked of the riderless horses. There would be no looking back. The journey back was a different kind of quiet. The tense, expectant silence of the hunt was gone, replaced by a stillness that was profound and deep. It was the silence of a storm that has passed, leaving the world washed, clean, raw, and utterly changed. They rode slowly, Silas's weary roan now carrying the two younger girls who had fallen into an exhausted, trauma-induced sleep. Silas and Lyra walked beside it, leading the new horse laden with their grim spoils. The desert, which had felt like an enemy territory on their journey out, now felt like a neutral ground, a silent witness to their passage. Its vast emptiness seemed to absorb their grief, its ancient patience putting their fleeting, violent struggle into perspective. They arrived at the site of Lyra's village at dusk. It was a ghost of a place, a collection of burned-out homes and scattered debris, a stark monument to the cruelty that had started everything. But it was not dead. Amidst the ruins, small fires flickered like defiant stars against the encroaching darkness. The people had returned. They were living in makeshift shelters, their faces etched with grief and hardship, but their spirits, like the stubborn desert plants that clawed life from the dry earth, had refused to die. As the four of them walked into the center of the camp, leading the two horses, a hush fell over the survivors. People stopped their work, their quiet conversations dying in their throats. They stared, their eyes wide and disbelieving. They saw not just the return of their chief's 3 daughters, but the entire story of their impossible journey written on them. They saw the blood and dust on their clothes, the grim exhaustion in their faces, and the captured rifles slung over the strange white man's shoulder. And they saw Lyra. They saw that the lost, frightened child who had been stolen from them was gone. In her place stood a leader, her face set with a sorrowful strength, her father's knife now rightfully hers, secured at her hip. An old man, an elder whose face was a map of a long and difficult life, stepped forward. His eyes, wise and ancient, moved from Lyra to her sisters, then to the silent, stoic man who stood with them, a figure who seemed to carry the shadows of the wasteland with him. The elder didn't need to ask what had happened. He could read the truth in their presence, in the hard-won, exhausted peace in their eyes. He looked at Lyra, and his gaze was filled not with pity, but with a deep, powerful, and solemn respect. "The debt," the elder said, his voice raspy but clear, carrying across the silent camp with the weight of a judge's verdict. "It is paid." In the days that followed, Silas stayed. He had intended to leave the next morning, but when he saw the immense task before them, the quiet pull of his own conscience wouldn't let him. He helped them. He said little, but his actions spoke volumes. He helped clear rubble, his raw strength making short work of tasks that would have taken 2 other men. He helped reinforce the perimeter of their new camp, his knowledge of defensive positions unspoken but clear. He hunted for them, his Winchester, providing fresh meat that they hadn't tasted in weeks. He was an outsider, a ghost from another world, yet they made a space for him. They accepted him, not through words, but through the simple, shared rituals of survival. They left a plate of food by his small, solitary fire each night. They watched him, this quiet, dangerous man, and they understood. They saw the bond between him and Lyra, a bond forged in blood and fire that needed no explanation. They saw that he had honored the memory of their fallen chief in a way no one else could have. Lyra, meanwhile, became the heart of her community. She was no longer just Cale's daughter, she was his legacy. She organized the rebuilding, her voice calm and certain, her decisions wise beyond her years. The grief was still there, a permanent shadow behind her eyes, but it no longer consumed her. It had been forged into a different kind of strength, the strength of a leader who had walked through the abyss and had brought her people back with her. On the 5th evening, the elder approached him as he sat by his fire, cleaning his rifle. The old man sat down opposite him, the firelight dancing between them. "You have a place here, Silas," the elder offered, his voice gentle. "Your spirit is strong and it is welcome in our home. You are a brother to us now." Silas was moved by the offer, more than he would ever admit. He stopped his work, looking into the flames. For a moment, a brief, tantalizing moment, he allowed himself to imagine it. A life of peace, a home, a community that would have him, an end to the endless, lonely trail. The thought was like a drink of cool water after a lifetime of thirst. But he knew, with a deep and weary certainty, that it wasn't his path. He was a storm, and storms were meant to pass through, not to settle. He was a man of the trail, a drifter, his only true home, the vast, empty space between one horizon and the next. His work here was done, The scales were balanced. "I thank you," Silas said, his voice low. "But my road lies elsewhere." The morning he left, the entire village came to see him off. He had packed his few belongings onto his horse, now rested and strong again. He stood before Lyra, her sisters at her side. The silence between them was thick, with unspoken gratitude, respect, and a shared, somber history. "You will be safe now," he said. It was the only thing he could think of to say, a simple statement of the fact they had bought with blood. She nodded, her gaze direct, unwavering. "Because of you." In her eyes, he saw that she understood him completely. She saw the quiet honor he lived by, the code that had compelled him to act. She saw the solitary nature of his soul. He simply tipped his hat, a gesture of farewell that was as much a part of him as his own skin, and mounted his horse. He didn't look back as he rode out of the camp. He couldn't. To look back would be to admit what he was leaving. But as he reached the top of the ridge overlooking the small, recovering village, he reined in his horse and allowed himself one last glance. He saw 3 figures standing where he had left them, 3 small silhouettes against the vast, morning sky. They were watching him. He could feel Lyra's eyes on him, even across the distance. It was a thank you, carried on the wind, more powerful than any spoken word. A small, rare, and melancholy smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth. He turned his horse toward the endless horizon, toward the next town, the next job, the next lonely campfire. He was alone again, as he was always meant to be. He patted his horse's strong neck. "No thanks needed," he murmured, "to the horse, to the wind, to the memory of a man named Cale. It was the right thing to do." He rode on, a solitary figure disappearing into the landscape, a man who had paid a debt of life with blood and honor. He left behind not a story of vengeance, but a quiet legend whispered around campfires, a reminder that even in the harshest of lands, a single act of kindness can echo through the years, demanding to be answered, and that true courage is sometimes just about keeping a promise the rest of the world has forgotten. Some trails must be walked alone. If this story of honor and grit resonated with you, comment number 8 with your favorite moment. These are the legends of the Old West we aim to keep alive. Thank you for riding with us to the end. So, the dust has settled in Widow's Pass. The story is over. Silas is riding off into the sunset, and Lyra has found her place as a leader. It's easy to close the book on a tale like that, to just see it as a good piece of Wild West fiction, a story of guns, grit, and revenge. But if we do that, I think we miss the whole point. Because a story like this isn't just about what happened back then, in some dusty, forgotten corner of the frontier. It's about the echoes it leaves behind, the lessons that are just as true sitting in your car, in your office, or in your home right now, as they were in a canyon filled with ghosts. The thing that really sticks with me, the central pillar of this whole tale, is this idea of a debt. Not the kind you owe the bank, but a debt of honor. Silas carried the memory of Cale's kindness for 5 long years. It wasn't on a ledger. No one was coming to collect. It was a silent, personal contract he had with himself. In a world that had likely shown him nothing but cruelty and self-interest, one single act of selfless kindness was so profound that it became a part of his internal compass. And I think that's something we can all understand. Who are the Kyles in our own lives? Maybe it was a teacher who saw potential in you that no one else did, a mentor at work who took you under their wing, a friend who sat with you in silence when you were at your lowest. Or maybe, just like for Silas, it was a complete stranger who showed you a moment of grace when you needed it most, and then just disappeared. These aren't debts that demand repayment in kind. The world doesn't work that way. The lesson isn't that we have to track these people down. The lesson is that we carry that debt forward. We pay it to the world. We become someone else's Cale. Honor, in its truest form, isn't about grand public gestures. It's about remembering. It's about that quiet internal voice that says, "Someone did right by me, so now it's my turn to do right by someone else." It's about showing up when it counts, not because you have to, but because your own code demands it. That's a principle that's as timeless as the rocks in those canyons. And then there's Lyra. Her journey is a powerful, if brutal, lesson in transformation. When we first met her, she was a victim, bound, helpless, being sold like an animal. It would have been so easy for her story to end there, or for her to simply be a passive character who was rescued. But she wasn't. Her transformation wasn't magical, it was forged. It was forged in the fire of her escape, in the cold focus of sharpening her father's knife, and in the terrible crucible of that final battle. She didn't wait for Silas to solve all her problems. She rose to meet the challenge. She became the protector of her sisters, the strategist of the ambush, the executioner of her family's murderer. What does that teach us? It teaches us that we are not defined by what happens to us. We are defined by how we respond. We all face hardships, moments that feel like they could break us. We lose jobs, we face betrayal, we grieve. In those moments, it's easy to feel like a victim, to feel powerless. But Lyra's story reminds us that hardship can also be a crucible. It can burn away the parts of us that are weak and reveal a strength we never knew we possessed. It's about agency. It's about realizing that even when the world has dealt you the worst possible hand, you still have a choice. You can choose to stay on the ground, or you can choose to stand up, pick up your own version of that knife, your skills, your voice, your resolve, and fight for the future you want. You become the hero of your own story, not by avoiding the battle, but by walking into it. Finally, let's talk about that single pivotal moment at the beginning. Silas could have walked away from that auction. In fact, every rational instinct probably told him to. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. Getting involved meant trouble, expense, and almost certain death. But he didn't. In one moment, he chose the harder right over the easier wrong. And that single choice set everything else in motion. It was the first domino in a chain that led to the rescue of 3 girls, the end of a band of marauders, and the rebirth of a community. We tend to underestimate the power of these small, principled moments in our own lives. The choice to speak up when you see an injustice at work, even if it makes you unpopular. The choice to stop and help someone stranded on the side of the road, even if you're running late. The choice to be honest when a lie would be so much easier. These moments feel small, but they have a ripple effect we can never fully predict. Every major change, every act of heroism, every story worth telling starts with one person making one choice to act with integrity. It's about being the person you want to be, even, and especially, when no one is watching. So when you put it all together, Silas's unwavering honor, Lyra's powerful transformation, and the single choice that started it all, you get more than just a good story. You get a blueprint for a life of purpose. It tells us that honor isn't passive. It demands action. It tells us that action is what forges our character. And it all begins with the courage to make a choice based on your own internal code. That's the true spirit of the West. It's not just in the landscape, it's in the character of the people who survived it, and that's a spirit we can all carry with us, long after the story ends. This tale has been one of honor, grit, and redemption, and your support has meant the world to us. This is our final call to action for this story. If you've ridden with us this far, comment number 9, and share the one lesson from this journey that you'll carry with you. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and share this series with anyone who believes that a good story can still teach us something about how to live. Thank you for being a part of this community. We'll see you on the next trail.